A high school track meet, a rain delay, hundreds of students waiting for the weather to pass. Then, in less than a minute, everything changed. What should have been an ordinary day of competition suddenly became the center of one of the most closely watched murder trials in America. A teenager was dead. Another teenager was placed in handcuffs. And now a courtroom is trying to answer a question that has divided families, communities, and millions following the case online. Was this cold-blooded murder? Or was it self-defense? As prosecutors opened their case, they revealed a shocking new detail about the knife allegedly used in the fatal stabbing. According to the state, this wasn't simply a pocket knife carried by chance. They claim the knife was already open before the confrontation even began. That revelation immediately changed the atmosphere inside the courtroom. Because if prosecutors are right, they say it suggests preparation. But the defense tells a very different story. They argue their client was trapped in a rapidly escalating confrontation. They say another teenager made physical contact first. They insist the stabbing happened during a moment of panic, fear, and chaos. Then came the surveillance footage. Then came the witnesses. Then came an emotional 911 call so disturbing that jurors reportedly struggled to hold back tears. And perhaps most shocking of all, testimony from a combat veteran who says he recognized the moment a teenager's life was slipping away. But what investigators discovered next would raise even more questions. Questions about the confrontation. Questions about the timeline. Questions about what happened under a crowded tent during a rain delay. And questions that could ultimately determine whether a teenager spends the rest of his life behind bars. Because as this trial unfolds, both sides agree on one thing. A life was lost, but they cannot agree on why, and that battle is only beginning. The case that has captured national attention is finally moving into its most important phase. After months of public debate, social media arguments, and competing narratives, prosecutors and defense attorneys are now presenting their versions of what happened on a rainy day at a Texas high school track meet. At the center of the case are two teenagers whose lives became permanently connected in a matter of seconds. One of them never made it home. The other now faces the possibility of spending much of his life behind bars. On the first day of testimony, both sides wasted no time introducing dramatically different explanations for the deadly confrontation. Prosecutors told jurors that this was not a tragic accident and not an act of self-defense. Instead, they argued it was an intentional killing that began with a simple request and ended with a teenager bleeding to death beneath stadium bleachers. The defense, however, painted a very different picture. They described a frightened teenager who found himself surrounded by hostility during a chaotic rain delay and who reacted in a split second after someone else initiated physical contact. Those competing narratives immediately set the stage for what could become one of the most closely watched trials of the year. Before either side presented witnesses, attention inside and outside the courthouse was already intense. Long before the doors opened, people reportedly lined up hoping to secure one of the limited seats available inside the courtroom. Interest in the case had grown steadily for months, fueled by questions surrounding the confrontation, the self-defense claim, and the fact that both the victim and the defendant were teenagers participating in a school athletic event. Unlike many high-profile trials, cameras were not permitted inside the courtroom. No live broadcasts were allowed. No live streams, no public video feed. That meant every detail emerging from the courtroom carried unusual weight, and almost immediately, prosecutors introduced information that had not previously received widespread public attention. According to the state, the knife allegedly used during the fatal encounter was not closed inside a pocket when the confrontation began. Prosecutors argued that the folding knife was already open. The significance of that claim cannot be overstated. If jurors ultimately believe the prosecution's interpretation, they may view the open knife as evidence that the defendant was prepared for violence before the confrontation ever escalated. Prosecutors suggested exactly that during opening statements, arguing that the defendant was effectively waiting for an opportunity to use the weapon. The defense strongly disagrees. Their position is that the presence of the knife alone does not prove intent to kill, and that the critical issue is what happened during the physical confrontation itself. But before jurors could evaluate those arguments, they first needed to understand how an ordinary school event turned into a homicide investigation. The timeline begins on April 2, 2025. Students from multiple high schools had gathered for a track meet in Frisco, Texas. Like countless school sporting events across the country, the day began as a routine competition. Athletes prepared for events, coaches moved between groups of students, families watched from the stands. Then, weather changed everything. A rainstorm moved into the area, forcing delays and sending students scrambling for shelter. It was a seemingly minor disruption, yet prosecutors argue that what happened next ultimately led to a teenager's death. According to testimony and statements presented in court, one school's team tent became an important location in the unfolding events. Students crowded underneath various tents seeking protection from the rain. Some schools had tents available, others reportedly did not. That detail would become a recurring theme throughout the first day of trial. Defense attorneys repeatedly emphasized that the defendant's school allegedly lacked a tent, arguing that seeking shelter from the rain was entirely reasonable under the circumstances. Prosecutors acknowledge the weather conditions, but contend that the conflict was never really about rain. Instead, they argue it became about confrontation. According to the state's version of events, the defendant moved underneath a tent associated with another school. Members of that school's team allegedly told him he needed to leave. The defense tells a different story. Defense attorneys claim the defendant recognized someone connected to his girlfriend and moved toward the area for innocent reasons. They argue he was confused when objections were raised about his presence beneath the tent. At first glance, the disagreement might seem insignificant, but prosecutors argue that what happened during those next few moments is the foundation of their entire case. According to the state, students asked the defendant to leave. He allegedly refused. Words were exchanged, tensions increased. Then, prosecutors claim, the confrontation escalated toward violence. One of the central figures in that confrontation was Austin Metcalf. By all accounts, Austin had arrived at the track meet expecting a normal day of competition. No witness has suggested he anticipated becoming involved in a life-or-death encounter, yet prosecutors say Austin became involved after noticing the defendant under the tent. What happened next remains heavily disputed. The state argues that the defendant challenged those confronting him and effectively dared them to force him to leave. The defense insists Austin became the aggressor. That distinction may ultimately determine the outcome of the trial, because everyone agrees on one critical fact: physical contact occurred. What jurors must decide is whether that contact justified what happened next. According to prosecutors, Austin approached the defendant during the argument. Moments later, a knife entered the confrontation. Within seconds, Austin suffered a fatal wound. Panic erupted. Students scattered. Coaches rushed toward the scene. And a routine high school track meet instantly transformed into a medical emergency. But as investigators began piecing together exactly what happened beneath that tent, another question emerged. A question prosecutors placed at the center of their opening statement. Why was a teenager carrying an open knife at a school sporting event in the first place? That question echoed throughout the courtroom, and prosecutors clearly want jurors thinking about it from the very beginning. Because while the defense focuses on the moments immediately surrounding the stabbing, the prosecution appears equally interested in the moments before it happened. What did the defendant intend? What was he thinking? Why was the knife available? And was this truly a spontaneous act of self-defense, or something else entirely? Those questions would become even more important once jurors saw the surveillance footage. Because although the video may not provide every answer, prosecutors believe it supports their version of events. The defense believes it supports theirs. And what investigators observed on those recordings would soon become one of the most closely debated pieces of evidence in the entire case. But before the footage was shown, jurors would learn that the fight beneath the tent lasted only moments. The consequences, however, would last forever. And as the first witnesses prepared to take the stand, the courtroom was about to hear details that would transform a disputed confrontation into a deeply emotional story of loss, survival, and a teenager's final moments. As opening statements concluded, prosecutors began presenting what they believe is some of the most important evidence in the case. Surveillance footage captured from multiple cameras overlooking the area where the confrontation occurred. For months, many people following the case had wondered whether video existed, and if so, what it actually showed. The answer, according to testimony presented in court, was complicated. Jurors were told that several surveillance cameras captured portions of the incident. However, the footage was reportedly recorded from a significant distance away. Investigators relied heavily on enhancements, zooming techniques, clothing identification, and frame-by-frame analysis to determine who appeared in the recordings. A forensic video analyst became one of the first witnesses called by prosecutors. His role was not to tell jurors what happened. Instead, his responsibility was to explain how investigators processed and enhanced the recordings. The distinction is important because while prosecutors view the footage as a key piece of evidence, the video itself reportedly does not provide a perfectly clear picture of every action that occurred beneath the tent. In fact, testimony suggested that many of the individuals visible in the footage appear only as distant figures moving through a crowded area. Nevertheless, prosecutors believe the recordings establish a critical timeline, and that timeline begins several minutes before the fatal encounter. According to testimony, the defendant can allegedly be seen entering the area beneath the tent before Austin Metcalf arrives. That detail may seem small, but prosecutors highlighted it because it helps establish who was present first, how long people remained under the tent, and the sequence of events leading up to the confrontation. Jurors reportedly watched footage showing students gathered underneath the shelter as rain moved through the area. At first, nothing appears unusual. Students stand together. Athletes seek cover. The atmosphere resembles what one might expect during a weather delay at a school sporting event. Then, the focus shifts. Additional students approach the tent. Among them, prosecutors say, is Austin Metcalf. What happened during the next few minutes may become one of the most contested sections of the entire trial, because although the video establishes movement and timing, it reportedly does not clearly capture every word exchanged between the teenagers. There is no audio. There is no direct recording of the argument itself. That means witness testimony becomes incredibly important, and that is where prosecutors and defense attorneys continue to diverge sharply. According to the state's theory, tensions began escalating almost immediately after objections were raised regarding the defendant's presence under the tent. Words were exchanged, positions shifted, students gathered nearby. Then, physical contact occurred. The exact nature of that contact remains one of the most significant questions facing jurors. Prosecutors have acknowledged that some form of physical interaction happened before the stabbing. The defense views that fact as central to its self-defense argument. The state, however, argues that physical contact alone does not justify the use of deadly force, and that legal distinction could ultimately become one of the most important issues jurors must evaluate. As surveillance footage continued playing inside the courtroom, prosecutors reportedly directed jurors' attention toward a sudden movement visible beneath the tent. Witnesses described what appeared to be a quick jolt between two individuals. According to prosecutors, that movement corresponds with the beginning of the physical confrontation. Moments later, chaos erupted. Students scattered in multiple directions. Groups that had been standing together suddenly broke apart. Individuals ran away from the area. From the perspective of investigators, the sudden reaction of dozens of students provides a powerful indication that something serious had just occurred. What makes that moment especially important is how quickly everything unfolded. By many accounts, the confrontation lasted only seconds. One moment, students were sheltering from the rain. The next, emergency responders were being called. The speed of the encounter has become a major theme for both sides. Prosecutors argue that the rapid nature of the incident demonstrates how quickly the defendant resorted to deadly force. The defense argues the opposite. They contend that the speed of events supports their claim that decisions were made under extreme pressure during a rapidly unfolding confrontation. As jurors absorbed the surveillance evidence, prosecutors continued building their narrative. Then, attention shifted toward what happened immediately afterward. Because once the stabbing occurred, every action taken by the people involved suddenly carried enormous significance. According to prosecutors, the defendant left the area almost immediately after the encounter. The state argues that his actions following the stabbing reveal consciousness of guilt. Prosecutors point to the fact that he allegedly dropped the knife and moved away from the scene. They suggest those actions are consistent with someone attempting to distance himself from what had just occurred. The defense again sees the situation differently. They argue that someone who believed he had just acted in self-defense would naturally want to escape a chaotic and potentially dangerous situation. In their view, leaving the area does not automatically prove criminal intent. Instead, they argue it may demonstrate fear and confusion. That disagreement highlights one of the fundamental challenges facing the jury. Nearly every important event in this case can be interpreted in more than one way. The confrontation itself, the physical contact, the use of the knife, the statements afterward, the decision to leave. Each side looks at the same facts and reaches dramatically different conclusions. And that pattern continued as witnesses described what happened in the immediate aftermath. One coach testified about seeing students running. Another described confusion spreading throughout the area. Others recalled hearing people shouting that someone had been stabbed. At first, many reportedly struggled to comprehend what they were hearing. After all, this was not a location where anyone expected violence. This was a school track meet, a place associated with competition, teamwork, and athletics, not a homicide investigation. Yet within moments, coaches and staff members were forced into emergency response roles. Several witnesses described rushing toward the scene without fully understanding what had happened. Only after reaching Austin did they realize the severity of the situation. That realization changed everything. Because while investigators would later focus on legal questions surrounding self-defense and intent, the people who arrived first were focused on something far more immediate: saving a teenager's life. And as prosecutors prepared to call additional witnesses, jurors were about to hear testimony that would dramatically change the emotional atmosphere inside the courtroom. What began as a discussion about surveillance footage and timelines was about to become something much more personal. Witnesses who stood only feet away from the aftermath would soon describe what they saw: the desperate attempts to stop the bleeding, the frantic efforts to keep Austin conscious, the panic spreading through the crowd, and the heartbreaking moments that followed as coaches and emergency responders fought to save a life slipping away beneath the stadium bleachers. For many observers in the courtroom, that testimony would become impossible to forget. And according to those present, the most emotional moments of the trial had not even arrived yet.